In the winter of 1896, municipal engineers in several European capitals recorded an unusual problem. Entire streets were being rebuilt several meters above their original ground level. City plans from St. Petersburg, Chicago, and Paris show older doorways, windows, and arcades sealed beneath new pavement, their existence noted but never fully explained. Official reports described these buried levels as outdated infrastructure, yet the scale was inconsistent with ordinary renovation. In some cases, fully developed urban layers, complete with drainage, stone foundations, and transport corridors, were deliberately covered and forgotten. These actions coincided with a period of widespread urban reorganization following floods, fires, and administrative reforms. However, the buried cities beneath modern streets suggest planning far beyond emergency repair. They point to systems designed for long-term habitation, abruptly rendered obsolete. If these structures were merely remnants of earlier towns, their disappearance would be unremarkable. But what if they belonged to a connected urban network, abandoned after a larger transition? And if so, why were these cities quietly sealed rather than studied?
When I first began examining the phenomenon of buried cities, I started where historians and urban planners begin, with the official explanations. In most academic literature, buried streets and submerged building levels are presented as an expected outcome of urban growth. Cities expand, ground levels rise, and older structures are gradually absorbed into the landscape. This explanation appears frequently in municipal records from the 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly during periods of rapid industrialization. According to this narrative, disasters play a central role. Fires, floods, and earthquakes are said to have damaged earlier neighborhoods, prompting reconstruction at higher elevations. In cities such as Chicago, large-scale fires are cited as justification for raising street levels. In European capitals, floods and sanitation reforms are often invoked. Engineers redirected rivers, installed sewer systems, and elevated roads to manage waste and prevent disease. Over time, earlier ground floors became basements, then were sealed entirely. I examined urban planning manuals from the late 1800s that describe these processes in detail. They outline methods for layering new streets over old ones, filling lower levels with soil or rubble, and repurposing existing buildings to fit updated regulations. In this framework, buried cities are not mysterious. They are simply obsolete infrastructure, replaced by improved designs as technology advanced. This explanation is reinforced by archaeological terminology. Terms like cultural layers and occupational strata are used to describe how civilizations build over themselves across centuries. Each layer represents a phase of habitation shaped by changing needs and materials. From this perspective, buried structures are evidence of continuity, not disruption. I also reviewed contemporary academic studies that stress gradualism. These works argue that urban elevation occurs incrementally, sometimes by only a few centimeters per decade. Over hundreds of years, such changes accumulate, creating the buried streets we observe today. In this model, there is no single moment of abandonment or concealment, only slow transformation. On the surface, this explanation appears coherent. It aligns with known historical events and fits within accepted models of urban development. It also requires no reassessment of timelines or systems. Cities evolve, technologies improve, and old designs fade away. However, as I continued reading excavation reports and early municipal surveys, I noticed something that did not fully align with this narrative. The official explanation assumes irregularity, uneven depths, fragmented remains, and partial survival. Yet many buried structures appeared intact, symmetrical, and deliberately sealed.
the consistency of these features seemed difficult to reconcile with slow accumulation alone. At this stage, I did not reject the accepted story. Instead, I treated it as a baseline. If buried cities were merely the byproduct of growth, the physical evidence should consistently reflect that process. The question was not whether urban layering occurred, it clearly did, but whether it explained everything visible beneath modern streets. It was this gap between theory and observation that led me to look more closely at what lay below.
As I moved from historical texts to physical evidence, the first contradictions began to appear. Excavation photographs, many taken during early subway construction projects, revealed buried levels that were not fragmented or degraded as one might expect from gradual sediment buildup. Instead, I observed complete floors, intact corridors, and aligned doorways sealed behind uniform layers of fill. In several cities, lower levels contained finished stonework, decorative arches, and consistent ceiling heights. These were not crude foundations or temporary structures. They appeared designed for long-term use. In some cases, windows faced what would once have been open streets, now replaced by solid earth. The official explanation suggests these were simply ground floors rendered obsolete, yet the preservation raised questions. I examined engineering diagrams from late 19th century infrastructure projects. They documented the deliberate infilling of lower levels, sometimes within remarkably short time frames. In certain cases, entire street networks were buried during a single redevelopment phase. This speed contrasts with the idea of slow accumulation over centuries. Another detail stood out. Many buried levels were remarkably clean at the point of sealing. There was little evidence of prolonged abandonment. Floors were intact, walls unbroken, and drainage channels unobstructed. If these spaces had gradually fallen out of use, signs of decay or adaptation might be expected. Instead, they appeared closed while still functional. Symmetry was another recurring feature. Street widths, street alignments, and structural proportions were consistent across buried sections. This uniformity suggested centralized planning rather than organic growth. Gradual urban layering typically produces irregular results, shaped by property boundaries and individual decisions. What I saw suggested something more coordinated. Early photographs offered additional clues. In several images, partially excavated streets reveal old storefronts emerging from beneath newly raised roads. Workers are shown clearing soil from doorways that align perfectly along entire blocks. These were not isolated structures, but continuous urban environments. The official narrative accounts for some of this by pointing to modernization campaigns. Cities, it argues, were systematically upgraded. Yet this explanation does not fully address why fully usable spaces were sealed rather than adapted, nor does it explain why similar architectural solutions appear in distant cities with different histories. At this stage, I found myself questioning not the existence of urban rebuilding, but its scale and intent. The evidence suggested that something more abrupt had occurred. The buried levels did not look like forgotten ruins. They looked like completed cities, deliberately removed from use. This raised a broader question. If these spaces were sealed intentionally, what circumstances required such action? Gradual growth does not necessitate concealment. One can renovate without burying entire streets. The depth and consistency of these buried layers implied a decision that extended beyond routine improvement. Rather than offering answers, the evidence pointed toward a process not fully described by official accounts. The more locations I examined, the more this pattern repeated. It was no longer a matter of isolated anomalies. The contradictions were accumulating, suggesting the need to look beyond local explanations and consider whether a larger pattern existed. When similar architectural features appear in one city, they can often be explained by local circumstances. But as I expanded my research geographically,
the same characteristics began to surface in cities separated by thousands of kilometers. Buried streets in Eastern Europe shared proportions with those in North America. Submerged arcades in Asia echoed designs found beneath Western capitals. I compared excavation records from different continents, focusing on depth, construction methods, and sealing techniques. The similarities were difficult to ignore. In many cases, buried levels sat between 2 and 4 meters below modern streets. The infill material was consistent, compacted soil mixed with debris, applied evenly across entire districts. The buildings themselves shared features: stone foundations of comparable thickness, brickwork laid in similar patterns, and standardized arch designs appeared repeatedly. These were not exact replicas, but they followed a recognizable logic. This raised the possibility that they were built according to shared principles rather than isolated traditions. I also noticed that the timing of burial events clustered within a relatively narrow historical window. Many cities undertook major elevation projects between the late 18th and early 20th centuries. Official explanations attribute this to industrialization, yet the synchronization remained curious. Independent cities, under different governments, appeared to make similar decisions at roughly the same time. Maps added another layer to the pattern. Older city plans often depicted dense urban layouts, where modern maps show open plazas or elevated streets. In several cases, earlier maps were quietly revised, removing references to lower districts. These changes were rarely explained in accompanying documents. I examined records of public works funding and noticed that large-scale burial projects were often framed as necessary but temporary measures. However, follow-up documentation was scarce. The buried districts were rarely revisited, studied, or integrated into later planning discussions. They simply disappeared from administrative focus. This repetition suggested coordination or shared influence. It did not require a single authority directing events, but it implied that similar conditions or pressures were acting across regions. The official narrative treats each city independently, yet the physical evidence suggested otherwise. At this point, the story shifted from local anomalies to systemic behavior. The question was no longer why one city buried its streets, but why so many did so in comparable ways. Gradual growth could explain some elevation, but it did not easily explain synchronized, large-scale sealing of functional urban spaces. I did not assume intent or motive. Instead, I focused on consistency. Patterns in architecture, timing, and administrative response pointed toward a shared process. Whether that process was economic, environmental, or technological remained unclear. What became evident was that the buried cities were not random byproducts of modernization. They formed a coherent layer beneath the modern world, one that followed recognizable rules. To understand why these spaces were abandoned, it was necessary to understand how they functioned when they were active. That question led directly to what lay beneath the surface.
As I studied the buried levels more closely, it became clear that their significance lay not only in their architecture, but in their systems. Beneath modern streets, I found evidence of integrated urban planning that extended beyond individual buildings. Drainage channels ran in organized grids, often larger and more refined than those used above ground today. Heating systems were particularly notable. In several buried districts, hollow wall cavities and subfloor channels suggested methods for distributing warm air or steam. These features were not improvised. They were incorporated into the original construction, indicating forethought and coordination. The official narrative does not fully account for why such systems would be abandoned wholesale.
Transport corridors also appeared beneath cities. Tunnels wide enough for carts, sometimes lined with stone, connected major structures. In some cases, these routes aligned precisely with surface roads above, as if the modern city had been built directly atop an earlier network. This continuity raised questions about the transition between systems. Structural uniformity was another key feature. Buildings followed consistent height ratios, foundation depths, and spacing. This level of standardization is difficult to achieve without centralized planning or shared technical knowledge. Yet these systems predate the regulatory frameworks typically credited with introducing such uniformity. Water management offered further clues. Buried channels showed evidence of controlled flow with sluice gates and sediment traps. These were not rudimentary drains. They reflected an understanding of hydraulics that matched the needs of dense urban populations. What struck me most was that these systems appeared complete. They were not experimental or transitional. They were functioning urban environments capable of supporting daily life. Their abandonment was not due to obvious failure. Instead, they seemed to no longer align with whatever system replaced them above ground. The official narrative suggests that modernization made older systems obsolete. Yet in several cases, the buried infrastructure appeared more robust than what followed. Narrower streets, reduced drainage capacity, and fragmented heating solutions replaced integrated designs. This raised a critical question. If these systems were effective, why were they not upgraded rather than buried? The evidence suggests a shift not only in technology, but in organizational priorities. The buried cities reflect a mode of urban life that ceased abruptly. I did not interpret this as proof of lost superiority. Rather, it suggested a change in context. Perhaps environmental conditions shifted. Perhaps economic models changed. Whatever the cause, the transition involved sealing entire systems rather than dismantling them piece by piece. Understanding these systems reframed the mystery. The buried cities were not accidental remnants. They were deliberate constructions abandoned as complete units. To understand why, it was necessary to examine how they were removed from use and how that process was recorded or not recorded by those in power. The question of abandonment led me into archives rather than excavations. I searched for records describing the sealing of these urban layers. What I found was not a single directive or event, but a pattern of administrative silence. Large-scale burial projects were mentioned briefly, often without explanation, then disappeared from official discourse. Policy shifts frequently coincided with these actions. Changes in land ownership laws, zoning regulations, and municipal authority occurred during the same periods. Lower districts were reclassified, sometimes labeled as unsafe or unsanitary, even when no specific issues were documented. In several cases, responsibility for buried areas was transferred between departments, effectively removing them from oversight. Once sealed, they were rarely inspected again. This was not presented as destruction, but as closure. The language was neutral, technical, and final. I noticed gaps in the records. Budgets accounted for fill material and labor, but not for the long-term implications. Reports ended abruptly, with no follow-up assessments. The buried cities became administrative non-entities. This silence contrasts with how cities typically document change. Major infrastructure projects usually generate extensive discussion and analysis, yet here, the most significant alterations were treated as routine. The absence of debate was itself notable. I also examined property registries. In some cities, parcels corresponding to buried districts were renumbered or merged. Original boundaries vanished. Over time, it became difficult to trace what had existed beneath newer developments. This process did not resemble emergency response. It unfolded methodically. Streets were raised, buildings sealed, and records adjusted. There was no apparent urgency, but there was also no invitation to examine what was being lost. The official explanation frames this as pragmatism. Cities, it argues, must move forward. Yet pragmatism does not require erasure. One can preserve plans, studies, and models. The lack of such material suggests that preservation was not a priority. Whether this silence reflects deliberate suppression or simple indifference remains unclear. What is clear is that the buried cities were not treated as heritage. They were treated as something to be moved past. By the time modern urban planning emerged, these layers were already forgotten. Their absence from education and public discourse ensured that later generations would not question their existence. The buried cities became invisible, not only physically, but historically. This left one final issue unresolved. We live above these systems today. Their presence still shapes our cities, even if we rarely acknowledge it. Understanding that relationship required turning attention to the present.
Today, modern cities rest directly atop these buried environments. Subways cut through old corridors. Basements open into sealed chambers. Occasionally, construction crews uncover doorways leading nowhere. These moments are treated as curiosities, not as prompts for deeper investigation. I compared modern infrastructure challenges with the capabilities suggested by what lies beneath. Flooding, heating inefficiencies, and transport congestion plague contemporary cities. Yet beneath them exist systems designed to manage similar problems in integrated ways. This contrast raises questions about what was lost during the transition. The official explanation maintains that progress is linear. Newer systems are assumed to be better. But the evidence suggests a trade-off. Modern cities prioritize flexibility and expansion, while buried systems emphasize stability and cohesion. Neither approach is inherently superior, but the shift was profound. What remains unclear is why these older systems were not studied more thoroughly. Advances in archaeology and engineering could benefit from understanding their design, yet access is limited and research is sporadic. I do not claim to know the purpose or origin of these cities. The evidence suggests intentional planning, widespread implementation, and abrupt abandonment. It does not explain motive. It does not assign blame. What it does suggest is that our understanding of urban history is incomplete. The buried cities challenge the idea that development is always additive. Sometimes entire ways of building are set aside. As modern populations grow and infrastructure strains increase, these forgotten foundations become more relevant. They remind us that alternative systems once existed, systems adapted to different assumptions about environment, economy, and society. The question is not whether these cities belonged to a lost civilization or a forgotten empire. The question is why they were removed from our collective awareness, and whether, in overlooking them, we are missing insights into our own future. The evidence remains beneath our feet, silent but intact. What it represents is still open to interpretation, and perhaps that uncertainty is the most important part of the story.